a key feature in our natural growth. What do I mean by developing your imagination from your social context? I mean, it should be your society that informs the outlook of your mind, rather than your outlook determining society, rather than funny books telling you to tell us certain things. That's where you get senseless intellectualizing. The dictating matter in developing our imagination, or even in developing our own minds, has to be the society, or has to be the context in which we live. We also need to encourage reading. I don't mean that kind of reading that is meant only for intellectual stimulation. We need a reading that will judge your imagination, so that as a result of the thinking that such reading would have provoked, you are in a position to produce new ideas. Let me illustrate this point by telling the story of Professor Eskia Mphahlele. For 7 long years, Eskia Mphahlele and his siblings were living in rural Limpopo, in a village called Maupaneng, near Leboa Khomo, under the care of their grandmother. Most of Professor Eskia's books are the synthesis of his rural experiences. Other books extend to the ghetto life in Marabastad, near Pretoria, and into the exile of 20 years that he lived. These 3 zones of being, the rural, the urban, and the global, had set off within Mphahlele what he calls a never-ending dialogue, a landscape whose story has no end. Perhaps, Professor Mphahlele, there was no end, there was no beginning in the first place, or else it may be our collective fate to be at a starting point all the time. What nature provided Mphahlele when he was in Limpopo, and what white violence in the city life of Pretoria and Johannesburg did on him, and the freedom as he wandered around the world, was that it created an observer and a participant in life who would never stop dreaming and re-dreaming himself. In simpler terms, Mphahlele had to learn how to deal with the world he found around him, the events of that world, and the people of that world. He needed meaning. In the process, he discovered the meaning that he is. So, his books are the testimony of how he has applied his senses and faculties on the world around him. Hence, he became the teacher he is. Mphahlele died long time ago, but I talk as if he's alive. Why? Because writers, and good writers, do not die. Their body may leave us, their books continue to speak to us. We are talking about reading to educate our imagination. The other question that is bothering me is, who amongst us will be able to undertake the tasks that we are setting for ourselves through this lecture? Or put differently, what kind of skills and attitude does one need in order to be equal to the task? The black psyche is still gravely damaged. Prof. Pashele, in his volume of essays, talks about a disinherited imagination. He makes a point about a crucial aspect in our behavior. That is the manner in which we think of standards as good because they are established by whites and by white tradition. Just recently, somebody called me on a Mother's Day. And she insisted that I must say something or do something because it is a Mother's Day. For all my young life, I have been in the care of my mother. And when she was tired and I was in a position to provide, I took every step to take care of her. Both of us, myself and my mother, belong to the lowest class available in this country. We have no life of amenities. We have a life of survival. What do we eat tonight? What shall we have tomorrow? And this is always on the spur of the moment. So where do you get the time as a class that survives to say, there's a day set for my mother, there's a day set for my father? You have to be together. Every day in the midst of a struggle to survive is your day, her day. So it is alien and foreign to me. It doesn't belong to my class. It will belong to societies that have enough cakes, just like Marie Antoinette of France, who, when the French Rebellion was coming, and it was whispered into her that the people are rising, she said, give them cakes, because she had a lot. So my class position, my occupation, what has informed my life is separate from what this other companion was trying to do. I don't live a borrowed feeling. I live in my feeling, in the feeling of my experiences. We need people who must provide ideas. So we must train ourselves to think. Why do we need ideas? We need, sound laughable, but this is a dangerous state of mind. That person has to work on her identity thoroughly. Then there is this other level, the dangerous level, where black life becomes cheap. Let's go back. In the mid-1980s, black people were killing other black people. A tire would be hurled around your neck. Your body would be doused with petrol. You will be set alight, and like cannibals, people will sing and dance while you are burning in excruciating pain of death. This was the most extraordinary and blood-chilling self-hate and low self-esteem that this country has ever seen. It was a total disregard for human life. The last question has been about our children and grandchildren. Our children are at crossroads, ladies and gentlemen. There are two streams of consciousness. One appears as a mainstream, while the other is a minor stream. The Western consciousness, with its aggressive powers to manipulate the material world, stands versus African consciousness, a consciousness that has been bruised and bullied by the West to such a point that it has to assimilate and synthesize, not in its own terms, but in the terms of the dominating culture. We are burdened with synthesizing the West and synthesizing ourselves. This demands immense labor, mental and physical labor. But we cannot take any shortcuts in the job of restoring African dignity. For too long, we have been socialized to view ourselves as inferior and incomplete. And we tended to believe in this idea. Hence, we have been discriminating each other, using all insults that whites had been using on all blacks. We must hold intelligent conversations with our children. We need not wait on them to ask intelligent questions. We should initiate these ourselves. In order to prepare ourselves for that job, we must jack ourselves up with all the trends that there are out there. The growth of the mind of our children cannot be left to white teachers. We are the ones who master the intricacies of their world, the African world. We have not spoken about the three important freedoms that are crucial for our growth and why the environment for such freedoms should be nurtured. These freedoms are the freedom to think, the freedom to inquire, and the freedom to express well thought and well researched ideas. Today is Africa Day. What is Africa Day? Africa Day is the day when the Organization of African Unity, OAU, was formed in 1963. African leaders at the time were concerned with the question of unity among the African people. These leaders had been schooled within the crucible of Pan-African conferences that started in 1900 under great global organizers such as Sylvester Williams and W.E.B. Du Bois. Those leaders were worried that as blacks, we were and we are still not in charge of anything that matters in global terms. With the coming in of the generation of leaders such as General Obasanjo of Nigeria, Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, Joaquim Chissano of Mozambique, the OAU was reconstituted as the African Union to be the center of programs for African advancement. So May 25th is a day that belongs to the calendar of struggle. It is a day for critical reflection. For our talk tonight, let us draw from the wisdoms of three major figures, thinkers who have been guiding the black world over the years, teachers whose committed efforts aimed at illuminating our minds have never ceased to work even beyond the grave. In his book, God of the Oppressed, Reverend James Cone explains the meaning of truth and commitment of living in the truth in these words. This is what he says. Our survival and liberation depends upon our recognition of the truth. And, okay, let's start again. Our survival and liberation depends upon our recognition of the truth when it is spoken and lived by the people. If we cannot recognize the truth, then it cannot liberate us from untruth. To know the truth is to appropriate it, for it is not mainly reflection and theory. Truth is divine action entering into our lives and creating the human action of liberation. Truth enables us to dance and live in the rhythm of freedom in our lives as we struggle to be who we are. Therefore, to speak the truth, we blacks must set forth the authentic experience of our blackness. That's James Cone. He refers to the truth not merely for the need to express it. Instead, he refers to the truth as a basic requirement of life and a virtue to commit to. And once we fail to recognize the truth, we will fail to free ourselves from the lies. Truth must live with us, not only as an instrument of reflection, but as an act of divinity that propels us to strive to higher heights of human freedom. These words from an African American brother who teaches us across the seas ate up the labor of my mother for over 70 years, after which it spat her like a bubble gum that has lost taste, to sit and rot in her two-roomed house without pension. No domestic worker ever gets pension, even after 70 years of hard work. In the 1980s, during my formative years in political activism, I had the fortune of mingling with the cream of the Black consciousness movement. Some of these people were contemporaries of Steve Biko. Others were fresh young minds who had gone through the University of Robben Island. Now, let's be together this one. Politics are about ideas. Politics are not about t-shirts, shouting slogans, or dancing around. In politics, you engage ideas of others. You create your own ideas, and you add value to the process. You engage in actions that are informed by ideas. And at some point, you reflect on your ideas and on your actions. In spite of the great work that we did when laying my political foundation, we never spoke about King William Star. Yet, my own foundation lies in this town, in a settlement that I may, by mistake, take for granted. The impact of this town on me and on my life was never put in focus by those discussions. When I look back, this is where my self-education should have started. Fidel Castro of Cuba was asked by his biographer, Ramonet, whether he had any regrets on the Cuban Revolution. This is how Castro answered. If we knew what we now know 20 years ago, today we would be 20 years ahead in our revolution. If we knew what we now know 20 years ago, today we would be 20 years ahead in our revolution. So it is this hindsight that has informed the subject of today. And as I have said earlier, there are no shortcuts in matters of this nature. We will have to march the mile. The 10th of May, 2021 marks the 186th year since the founding of King Williamstown as a capital town of a British Crown colony called British Kaffraria in 1835. It was declared by a governor of the time, and his name was Governor Sir Benjamin Devon. This is what he said when he declared this town. Here, on the fertile banks of this clear, rapid, and beautiful stream, and upon ground admirably fitted by nature for the purpose of a provincial town, the Commander-in-Chief has fixed the site of one and named it by a general order of this day, King William's Town. This was signed on the 10th of May, 1835. The statement was an official declaration of my hometown as a capital of a crown colony that the British were creating. First named as the Queen of Adelaide Province, after the wife of King William IV, and later the British Kaffraria, meaning the land of the Kaffars. The British settlers were establishing themselves after conquering and expelling what they termed as hostile Xhosa. From this land, between the two great rivers, the Kiskama River, that is somewhere in Pedi, and the Kai River as we go further towards the east, an area of 7,000 square miles. A historian, while looking at this, wrote, his name is Lester, Queen Adelaide Province became the first British attempt to extend British direct rule over a large body of formerly independent and definitely hostile Africans. No such ambitious scheme had ever been attempted before in Southern Africa, and no such scheme would even be seriously contemplated elsewhere in Africa until the late 19th century. So you are a supreme project. For all my conscious life in this town, later we can talk of English Africa, French Africa, Portuguese Africa, and so on. There must have been a conference somewhere in Britain. For now, let us call it the London Conference, where the British decided to carve my homeland, the land where my home is, into white farms and white farm towns named after the invading race. The Berlin Conference was convened in the middle of wars across Africa. At that point, Europeans were beginning to fight among themselves over the fertile lands of my continent. They needed to come together and address their common interest. That common interest being to enslave, to oppress, to exploit, and to dispossess Africa. The London Conference, my own creation, because the colonial office was situated in London anyway, had also come on the heels of bruising wars. The English were not only going to enslave, oppress, exploit, and dispossess amaXhosa. They wanted to settle themselves on the land of my people. Listen to the logic of the British invaders, as reflected in the words spoken by their colonel, Harry Smith, when he explains their understanding when dispossessing Africans of their land. This is what Smith says, and just listen carefully. Conquest establishes the right of possession, are the Kafirs, the possessors of this soil by right of conquest, not to be ejected by the same right? Are they alone of all the rest of the origins from whom England has wrested her possessions to be thus favored? These tossers are irreclaimable savages whose extermination would be a blessing. To demonstrate the extent of the resolve of the British in expropriating the lands of amaXhosa, they built military installations, missionary stations, and European cultural institutions. For real permanence and in support of the institutions that they were establishing, the British built stone walls to punish and demoralize black resistance. They built hospitals to kill the indigenous health systems. They built in their capital, King Williamstown, what Governor Sir Harry Smith called a great kraal. This is where annual meetings were held, and the new bosses of the land, the British, would make speeches and warnings for those who resisted foreign rule. So King Williamstown is a story of British governors, British sirs, British commissioners, high and low, British or Christian missionaries and their societies, members of parliament in Britain and in Cape Town, politicians and bureaucrats in the colonial office in London, European settlers and anthropologists, travelers and merchants. It is a story of Governor Durban, Governor McLean, Governor arrived in the Eastern Cape on a ship that docked in Port Elizabeth, in December 1834. Smith had been knighted, given a sir after a stint in India. He had a doctoral degree from Cambridge University. This was his second coming to South Africa. I have brought in this fact of a doctoral degree because I want us to understand the nature of somebody who would have done such higher education, would have got such a high achievement, yet he is at the leading point of violence on other people. These are people that you would think of as cultured. But you will hear what he is capable of doing. This was his second coming to South Africa. Earlier, he had commanded British troops during the 6th Land Dispossession War between 1834 and 1835. In that war, Smith killed uNkosi uYinza by using the same trick, a mischievous invitation into peace negotiations in his camp. During his arrival in Port Elizabeth, Smith was welcomed by the general of amaXhosa armies, General Makoma. Instead of accepting the honor from a senior figure in the leadership of amaXhosa, Smith drew his sword and made a gesture of attack towards Makoma, with his white crowd approvingly laughing loud. At his hotel, he ordered Makoma to his knees. He placed his boot on Makoma's neck and said, "This is to teach you that I am come hither to show amaXhosa that I am chief and master here." Smith then came to Grahamstown, where uNkosi Sandile was held. Brandishing a gun, he informed Sandile that he was the great chief, a chief of all chiefs. And when he was satisfied that he had made his point, he then proceeded to King Williamstown. Here, he ordered all the royal leaders of amaXhosa to be brought before him. He humiliated them publicly, shamboked them on the buttocks, sat on his horse, and ordered that they kiss his boot one by one. George Grey was another fellow. He arrived in South Africa in 1854 to be the governor of the Cape. In 1841 up to 1845, Grey was a governor of Australia. In 1845 up to 1854, he was made a governor of New Zealand. So South Africa, and Eastern Cape in particular, was the apex of Grey's colonial governorship. My home was where he would prove his lasting legacy in treating the conquered. 2 years after his arrival, we experienced the Nongqawuse catastrophe. On his third year, he was settling military veterans of the Anglo-German Legion in my homeland and women who were classified as unmarried Irish women who were on a ship that wrecked in East London called Lady Kenaway. It was under Grey's time when Maqoma and other senior personnel in the armies of Amaxhosa, such as Siolo and Koko, were arrested, sentenced, and sent to the Robben Island prison in 1858. After serving 9 years, they were all released in 1867. In 1877, Siolo and Koko, who had rejoined the war after release, died in the 9th War of Land Dispossession. Before that, Maqoma had been rearrested and resent to the Robben Island prison in 1871. This time, he could not come out alive. Grey earned a lot of praises for taking over our lands. Listen to Meriband, quoted from a book by Mostert entitled Frontiers. This is what he says. We must remember that we have entrusted these affairs to a man of singular and proved ability in dealing with savage races. That is now you. If he succeeds in this experiment, we will have accomplished what none of his predecessors ever dreamt of. So the British were well prepared to conquer and own our lands. They started by imposing their identity on our landscape. They proclaimed the British Kaffraria. They named our territories Cambridge, Yorkshire, Middlesex, Lincoln, Province of Victoria, Beaufort, Albany, Somerset, Northumberland, Sussex. They established farm towns and called them Berlin, Frankfurt, Hanover, Stutterham, London, King Williamstown, Grahamstown, Queenstown, Adelaide, Alice, Hamburg. I can go on and on and on. These foreign markings are very important in understanding the British colonial imprint in this part of the world. The British territorial arrogance and its effect on those of us who were colonized, us blacks. Can I take some water? Yes. Are you enjoying this? Are you following this? Should I go on? Yes. It must be emphasized. I wish it was vodka. It must be emphasized that King Williamstown stands on the land of black people. There are original black names and black history for our lands. That history is there and it is well known to the people. The first European Christian missionary who arrived in this town was received by Amaxhosa. He was given land to set up his station. His name was Reverend John Brownlee. He came from Scotland in a town called Hamilton. He was sent here by the London Missionary Society. The history of the Brownlees is well engraved in this town. There is, of course, a church that is named in his memory. there are residential areas that are also named after him. What this memorialization has done, it has made us not to know the names of those blacks who were generous enough in allowing a Scottish man to settle among them. When you place a foreign memory in the place of the memory of the place, over time, the authentic memory will be forgotten. There were other Brownies in this area who held strategic positions in the colonial administration. There was a magistrate called William Thompson Brownlee, who was nicknamed Ubuso Bengwe, the face of the tiger. Well, it must have been his harshness when dealing with blacks who appeared before him that earned him such a horrible name. We need researchers who are keen with these matters, who will dig out the true history of our lands, develop knowledge that will empower our children and grandchildren. We need committed and enlightened members of society who are prepared to expose the damage that was caused by British land dispossession, while at the same time decolonizing our lands. As our land spaces were being defined as white areas through violent and forceful removals, we were squashed on the margins and were to be monitored through police raids. They created a physical distance that ensured that whites were not infected by the ditch and filth in our blackness. We were dumped on the other side of the tracks. It had to be clear to everyone who was superior and who was inferior. The history of foreign markings on our land is also important in understanding us, the children of the conquered race, children who had to observe and are now questioning the disorder. We are products of the history of land dispossession. We are the natural heirs of this history, whether it is bitter or sweet. That is why we have to learn from our history. This history is about us and about our people and our land. In other words, it is our history and it is our mission. Once we take the wisdom of learning from our history, we will be empowering ourselves with means of assessing our potentials in the face of our current struggles. Depending on the capabilities that we possess, as we learn from history, we should be able to establish some sense of purpose on our part and an understanding of the possibilities of a meaningful existence. This reasonable expectation on our part of our future endeavors will, of course, be based on the honest judgment on our capabilities and possibilities. We shouldn't be lying about ourselves. We shouldn't say that we're capable of this, yet we are not. It will always rely, and it will always rely on the honesty in judging ourselves, our capabilities, and the possibilities that there are. Most crucial is our attitude to our past, our keenness towards our history. There are priceless wisdoms in our past. Our past is the carrier of invaluable coping skills, skills that were accumulated over the years of trial and error by our ancestors. This access to crucial aspects of one's past opens one to crucial aspects of one's contemporary and future realities. Also, You cannot be easily misdirected in life when you are in grasp of your past. What is important here is to understand the importance of the sense of continuity and equally so the dangers of disconnection. Our thinking should root us on a long-term, conceptual, sequential, relational kind of thinking. We must not be fragmented in our thinking and in our actions. As we engage in our everyday struggles, such as the demolition of our sports facilities in favor of profit-making, we must put a detailed consideration of the reality of the now and the reality of the distant past and how these relate with the reality of our future. For example, the manner in which we lost our land to the British involved deceit and war. Today, the list that is left, such as the Victoria grounds, a small ground that caters for all the communities around this town, is being lost through deliberate falsification of the mind. We need to be clear and emphatic that the building of a business empire is not the development of our people. It is simply what it is, business. They are making black people to believe that when a sports is taken away for a shopping center that should collect the welfare grants and make them rich is equal to making your life easy. Yes, it would be easy to walk about in a shopping mall if things were free. But to lose an aspect of your life, the history associated with that site where the world buried Biko, to agree that a whole cultural self be cut away in favor of somebody's profit, that is unacceptable. It should not happen. So the frame of our thinking must be armed with sufficient insight and foresight, because we have to be all the time in a position of power. And the freeing of the mind is the most powerful thing that we can do for ourselves. We live in hard times, ladies and gentlemen, times where resources for these kind of activities are hard to come by. In the presence of a government that pretends to be an institution of the people to enable their enhancement, it is not uncommon to be treated shabily by even insignificant officials. Money can be an important resource, but it is not a major determinant whether these kind of activities will take place or not. It takes courage, vision, a sense of purpose, and of course, an unflagging stubbornness of will to do these things. These spineless, belly-crawling stooges of the ANC government must enjoy their day while the sun shines for them. Anyway, Professor Mphahlele teaches us that a democratic government does not regard aspects of a people's civilization as priority in its business. In his words, Mphahlele says, it is not uncommon to go through democratic procedures to elect a parliament of fools, idiots, morons in that order of ascendance. Ladies and gentlemen, we have spoken about John James Cole, Eskia Mphahlele, and Steve Biko. Now we should end with Ben Oken. We are where we are at most because of our own doing. 1994 was, for us, the end of the road. We were wrong. In 1968, our Ghanaian brother, iQonce, in his book, The beautiful ones are not yet born. He warned us of money changing hands, throats getting moistened, palms getting greased. We did not listen. Because we are hard at hearing, we need Ben Okri in his book, Songs of Enchantment, to plead with us yet again, as he writes. We didn't see the 7 mountains ahead of us. We didn't see how they are always ahead, always calling us, always reminding us that there are more things to be done, dreams to be realized, joys to be rediscovered, promises made before birth to be fulfilled, beauty to be incarnated, and love embodied. We didn't notice how they hinted that nothing is ever finished, that struggles are never truly concluded, that sometimes we have to redream our lives, and that life can always be used to create more light. We didn't see the mountains ahead, and so we didn't sense the upheavals to come. Upheavals that were in fact already in our midst, waiting to burst into flames. We didn't see the chaos growing, and when its advancing waves found us, we were unprepared for its feverish narratives and wild manifestations. This is a story for all of us who never see the 7 mountains of our secret destiny, who never see that beyond the chaos, there can always be a new sunlight. I'm about to leave you. Our theme was about the land taken by the British and now taken by the ANC government and its business crooks. John Matera has a poem that speaks to this situation. The title of the poem is The Day They Came for Our House. John Matera used to live in Sophia Town. In 1962, he was old enough and he witnessed how they demolished his own home. So this poem takes us to that day in 1962. The sun stood still in the sullen wintry sky, a witness to the impending destruction. Armed with bulldozers, they came to do a job, nothing more, just hired killers. We gave way. There was nothing we could do. Although the bitterness stung in us, in the place we knew to be part of us, and in the earth around, we stood, slow, painfully slow. Clumsy crushers crawled over the firm pillars into the rooms that held us and the roof that covered our heads. We stood. Dust clouded our vision. We held back our tears. It was over in minutes. Done. I am finished. Let's give him the round of applause once more. Thank you, Doc, for that powerful presentation. You've tried to tell us that history is very important. We need to know where we are coming from. We need to know the situation at the moment so that we can be able to carve a better future for us all. Thank you, Doc. Now we are going to have questions. This is an opportunity to ask if you have any question. Now, do we have the second mic? Yes. Okay. Yes, questions and